The wind outside my observatory howled a mournful, relentless song against the thick glass, a constant reminder of the world I had chosen to leave behind. Here, perched high above the nearest settlement, the isolation was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak I wore with a certain pride. Below, unseen in the blanket of snow and night, lay the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, a place I rarely visited, a world apart from my own. My world was the cold, sterile glow of monitors and the distant, silent language of the cosmos. I ran a gloved hand over the cool metal of the console. Even indoors, the chill seeped into my bones, a familiar companion. My breath plumed faintly in the air as I leaned closer to a flickering display. For years, my days had been a meticulous dance of data streams, calibration logs, and the endless pursuit of patterns in the cosmic static. Most days, I found nothing but the expected, predictable hum of the universe going about its business. Tonight felt different. A faint anomaly had surfaced hours ago, a barely perceptible ripple in the background radiation. At first, I dismissed it as instrument noise, a stray cosmic ray, or perhaps a minor fault in the aging array. I ran the diagnostics, cross-referenced the readings with historical data, and even checked the external weather sensors for unusual atmospheric interference. Everything came back clean. The observatory was functioning perfectly. The air outside was still, save for the wind. The sky, a velvet expanse of impossible blackness, was clear, yet the anomaly persisted. It wasn't a sudden spike, nor a random burst. It was, subtle, a deviation from the expected Gaussian distribution, a tiny, almost imperceptible flatness in a region where there should have been only chaos. My fingers, accustomed to the precise movements of the keyboard, hovered over the controls. I adjusted the filters, narrowing the bandwidth, focusing the primary dish on the precise coordinates where the aberration originated. My brow furrowed. This was unusual. The most distant signals we typically detected were faint echoes from early star formation or the violent signatures of merging black holes in nascent galaxies. Never anything from between them. The sheer distance alone made any detectable signal improbable, let alone one that wasn't immediately dismissible as background noise. I isolated the frequency range, the screen bathing my face in an eerie green glow. The noise floor dropped, and there it was, clearer now, a faint, rhythmic pulse, not a natural pulse like a pulsar, which would have a distinct signature of rapid, decaying energy. This was too clean, too consistent. It was as if something was tapping on the window of reality, precisely, deliberately. My heart gave a faint, uncomfortable lurch. This was not the chaotic beauty of the universe I had grown to love. This was something else. The data scrolled across the multiple displays, each line confirming the last. The signal was weak, incredibly so, yet its pattern was undeniable. It wasn't random. It wasn't static. There was a discernible structure to it, a repeating sequence of modulated frequencies that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. My breath hitched. This wasn't a discovery of a new type of star or a distant galaxy. This was something far more profound and unsettling. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and scientific rigor, began to race, piecing together the impossible. The signal was ancient. Given the distance, it must have traveled for billions of years to reach us. Billions. And yet it retained its structure, its integrity. How? What kind of civilization, what kind of entity could even conceive of such a feat? I stared at the screen, the rhythmic pulses a silent, insistent drumbeat in the stillness. My hands trembled slightly as I initiated a deeper spectral analysis. The computer whirred, its internal fans a low thrum against the howling wind outside. The processing bar crept across the bottom of the display, agonizingly slow. Each second felt like an hour. When the analysis completed, the results were laid bare, stark, and undeniable. The signal was not merely structured, it was intricate. It displayed patterns within patterns, a complex mathematical symmetry that was utterly alien. It was a language, perhaps, but one built on principles I couldn't yet grasp. It was a message, undoubtedly, but from whom? This wasn't just a groundbreaking scientific find, it was an intrusion. What could possibly exist out there, in that unimaginable emptiness, capable of such a feat? And what, precisely, was it trying to communicate? The wind, a tireless sentinel, still worried the observatory's thick glass, its mournful wail a constant companion through the long night. I hadn't slept. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, were fixed on the primary monitor, the raw data scrolling relentlessly. The initial shock had given way to a frantic, almost desperate compulsion. This wasn't just a signal, it was an interrogation, a challenge hurled from the deepest, most silent parts of the void. Air in the dome tasted stale, thick with the scent of ozone and forgotten coffee. My fingers, numb with cold despite the space heater humming weakly in the corner, danced across the keyboard, calling up analysis protocols, frequency filters, and pattern recognition algorithms. Each click, each whir of the cooling fans felt amplified in the profound quiet of my isolation. I started with the basics, stripping away the cosmic background noise, the faint hum of stellar nurseries, the distant echoes of quasars. My software, a bespoke labyrinth of my own design, worked tirelessly, sifting through terabytes of information. At first, it looked like pure chaos, a jagged landscape of random peaks and valleys. My scientific training screamed for a natural explanation, a pulsar's unique signature, a gravitational lensing anomaly, some exotic yet explicable astrophysical phenomenon. But the deeper I delved, the more those explanations crumbled. A subtle regularity emerged, faint at first, like a ghost in the machine. I adjusted the parameters, zooming in, refining the filters. The noise receded and the ghost solidified. It wasn't a natural curve, no graceful sine wave or chaotic fractal found in cosmic dust. This was deliberate. The patterns were too precise, too intricate, repeating not in simple cycles, but in nested sequences, like a cosmic clockwork mechanism where each gear turned another. Far smaller gear, which in turn influenced 1,000 more. My breath hitched. This wasn't noise. This was a message. But from whom and why, days blurred into an endless cycle of caffeine and data. My beard grew coarse, my clothes clung to me with the faint odor of exhaustion. The only breaks I took were to refill my thermos or stare out at the indifferent, snow-swept peaks, trying to re-anchor myself in a reality that felt increasingly flimsy. Each time, my gaze was drawn back to the glowing screens, to the evolving tapestry of abstract symbols and impossible structures forming before my eyes. The patterns weren't just repetitive, they were structured, like a language, but one utterly alien. There were no obvious symbols I could recognize, no discernible linguistic roots. Yet the way elements combined, the way certain sequences modified others, suggested syntax. This wasn't mathematics as I knew it. It was something beyond. A logic derived from principles I couldn't even begin to articulate. The data streams pulsed with an internal coherence that defied every known law of information theory, every constraint of causality. How could such complexity arise spontaneously? I tried cross-referencing with known terrestrial languages, dead and living, with ancient pictograms, even with complex biological codes. Nothing. The signal laughed at my attempts, presenting new layers of intricacy, new symmetries that broke every rule I tried to impose on them. It was like trying to understand a symphony by counting individual notes, only to discover the notes themselves were constantly changing their fundamental properties based on the context of the entire, impossibly long composition. The air around me grew heavy, as if the immense weight of the signal's implications was pressing down on the very fabric of the observatory. What kind of intelligence could conceive of such a thing? My internal clock shattered. I started seeing patterns in the frost on the window pane, in the grain of the wooden desk, my mind struggling to impose the signal's logic onto the mundane world around me. The isolation, once a comfort, now felt like a trap, amplifying every strange resonance the signal seemed to stir within me. My only contact with the world below was the occasional, brief flicker of lights from the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, a distant, comforting glow that now seemed impossibly far away, like a fading memory. Then, a breakthrough, or what felt like one. After days of relentless processing, a particular sequence resolved itself. It wasn't a word or a number or an image. It was a rule, a fundamental instruction encoded within the signal's very architecture, detailing how subsequent patterns should be interpreted, how they related to one another. It was a metalanguage, a Rosetta Stone built into the message itself. This wasn't random noise. This wasn't even complex natural phenomena. This was designed. The discovery filled me with a terrifying exhilaration. I was on the precipice of something monumental, something that would rewrite every textbook, every understanding of existence. The sheer scale of the signal's ancientness, the impossible complexity of its structure, hinted at an intelligence so vast, so far removed from anything humanity had ever conceived, that its very existence felt like a violation of reality. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the warmth of the heater. What did this incomprehensible entity want? The primary monitor still hummed, a low, persistent thrum against the silence of the observatory. The raw data, a relentless cascade of numbers and glyphs, had burned itself into my vision. Frantic, didn't begin to capture the state I was in. It was a cold, surgical desperation, a gnawing need to understand what my instruments had unveiled. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My coffee tasted like ash, my eyelids felt like sandpaper. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness in the face of this impossible truth. My scientific training, the bedrock of my entire existence, offered no further avenues. The signal was an anomaly so profound it broke every known law, every established theory. Logic screamed for a solution, but logic had been found wanting. Tales of ancient civilizations, not just on Earth, but across various cultures, possessing a strange, unified awareness of celestial phenomena far beyond their technological means. Accounts of star maps that depicted impossible objects, or symbols that seemed to represent cosmic structures no human eye could ever see. These were dismissed as superstition, the fevered dreams of primitive minds. But what if they weren't? What if they were echoes, distorted reflections of a truth too vast to grasp directly? The thought, once a fleeting curiosity, now seized me with a terrifying grip. I needed to find these forgotten narratives. I needed to see if humanity, in its infancy, had somehow glimpsed what my telescopes now revealed. My search began online, a desperate clawing through obscure forums and digitized archives, filtering out the conspiracy theorists and the charlatans. Eventually, a name surfaced, repeatedly linked to the collection and preservation of truly ancient, often unsettling texts, an antiquarian, rumored to reside in a remote, isolated corner of the world. The journey was a blur of grinding gears and frosted glass. I drove for hours, leaving the familiar hum of civilization behind, following winding roads that narrowed to icy tracks. Snow began to fall, a relentless curtain of white that swallowed the landscape, erasing the road markers, turning the world into a featureless expanse of gray and white. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road opened slightly into a valley, cradling a mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. It was a place frozen in time. Its wooden buildings hunched against the snow, chimneys exhaling plumes of smoke that dissipated into the heavy, still air. There were no streetlights, only the soft glow of oil lamps behind frosted windows. I felt a primal unease, an outsider intruding on a secret. The few figures I saw, bundled in thick furs, moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, their gazes long and appraising. They seemed to possess an ancient patience, a knowledge of the land, and perhaps of something else. I found the antiquarian's shop tucked away at the end of a narrow, unplowed lane. It was an unassuming building, indistinguishable from the others save for a faded, hand-painted sign depicting an owl perched on a stack of books. The air inside was heavy and still, thick with the scent of aged paper, dry leather, and something else, a faint, earthy aroma, like undisturbed soil or ancient stone. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy window panes, illuminating shelves crammed with volumes of every conceivable size and material. My breath caught in my throat. The antiquarian, a gaunt, stooped figure with hands like gnarled roots, emerged from behind a towering stack of scrolls. I explained my unusual request, carefully omitting the true nature of my discovery, framing it as a search for ancient cosmological myths. The antiquarian listened, his head cocked slightly, a thin smile playing on his lips. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, guiding me deeper into the labyrinthine shop, past shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten histories. He presented me with a heavy, leather-bound tome, its pages brittle and yellowed. "The Chronicles of the Veiled Firmament," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. Rarely consulted. My eyes scanned frantically, searching for anything, a familiar shape, a resonance. Then I saw it, a diagram, crudely etched but undeniably precise. It depicted a series of concentric circles, spiraling inward, each intersected by an intricate web of lines and dots. My breath hitched. The patterns within the diagram, the specific ratios of the concentric circles, the way the lines intersected, they were not identical to my signal's data, no. But the structure, the underlying principle of its complexity, the way it conveyed information through an intricate, non-linear arrangement, it was an undeniable, terrifying echo of the impossibly ancient signal. It wasn't a mathematical formula, but a visual language, a symbolic representation of the same alien architecture my instruments had detected. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, the heavy book almost slipping from my grasp. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a blueprint, a pre-human understanding, a myth born from an observation. How could ancient people, without telescopes, without any understanding of astrophysics, have conceived of something so utterly alien, yet so structurally resonant with what my observatory had captured? What horrifying vision had they witnessed that had compelled them to etch this forbidden knowledge into stone and parchment, passing it down through generations, hidden in plain sight? Humanity hadn't merely dreamed of cosmic horrors. It had seen them, and it had forgotten, or perhaps deliberately buried the memory. What else had they known, and what did this diagram truly represent? My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, the ancient script, a dizzying array of symbols and pictograms. Then I saw it. It depicted a series of concentric circles, spiraling inward, each segment filled with symbols that pulsed with a silent, terrible significance. I stared, my breath catching in my throat, at what appeared to be the source of the signal. It wasn't a star, not a galaxy. It was an absence, a void at the very heart of the diagram, surrounded by a complex geometry that defied every law I knew. The morning light, thin and watery through the frosted panes of my study, did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within my bones. I had slept little, the diagram a persistent afterimage behind my eyelids. My coffee, usually a comfort, tasted like ash. I pushed the mug aside, the clatter loud in the quiet room. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf, to the worn copy of Laplace's Celestial Mechanics. I could have sworn I'd left it on the second shelf, nestled between my own early papers and a collection of cosmological essays. But there it was, perched precariously on the top shelf, its spine askew, almost as if it had been tossed there in haste. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. Had I put it there? I walked over, reaching for the book. As I pulled it down, a small, polished stone, smooth and black as obsidian, tumbled from between its pages, landing with a faint clink on the wooden floorboards. I bent to retrieve it. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It felt cool, almost unnaturally so, against my palm, its surface reflecting the dull light of the room with an unsettling depth. I frowned, turning it over and over. Where had it come from, and why was it in my book? I tried to immerse myself in the familiar comfort of my data logs, the precise lines of spectral analysis. The signal was still there, unwavering, impassable. I pulled up the latest readouts, the intricate patterns of modulated energy. My eyes scanned the screen, but the numbers seemed to swim, to distort at the edges of my vision. A sudden, sharp pain flared behind my eyes, a pressure that felt like something pushing in. I blinked, rubbing my temples. When I opened my eyes again, the lines on the monitor weren't quite straight. They rippled subtly like heat haze over asphalt before snapping back into perfect alignment. My breath hitched. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beginning to thump an erratic rhythm against my ribs. Had I imagined it? The migraine was certainly real, a dull throb behind my left eye. Perhaps it was just fatigue playing tricks. Later that afternoon, needing fresh air, I bundled myself in my thickest coat and ventured out into the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. The snow crunched under my boots, a familiar sound, yet today it seemed sharper, more brittle. The few townsfolk I passed offered curt nods, their faces weathered and guarded. I felt their eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Respect, suspicion. The afternoon sun, weak as it was, cast long, distorted figures across the snow-covered ground. It was gone in an instant, a blink replaced by the normal, expected silhouette. My vision blurred. I stopped dead in my tracks, my gloved hands clenching into fists. My head spun. The cold air suddenly felt suffocating. There was I seeing things. There was the isolation, the sheer weight of this impossible discovery finally breaking me. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. The black stone sat on my desk, a silent sentinel. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. I tried to read to distract myself, but the words on the page blurred, sometimes rearranging themselves into meaningless strings of letters before my very eyes. My mind felt like a sieve, leaking coherence. Sleep, when it finally came, was no refuge. The dreams were no longer vague anxieties. They were vivid, intrusive, like direct mental assaults. I stood in an endless expanse of fractured light, where space itself seemed to tear and mend, constantly shifting. Shapes formed and dissolved, impossible angles intersecting with non-existent planes. And through it all, a sense of immense, ancient intelligence, not malevolent in a human way, but utterly indifferent, utterly alien, observing, dissecting. It wasn't a dream I was having. It felt like a dream I was being shown. A fragment of something vast and terrible, pressed directly into my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body felt frozen, paralyzed, as if something held me captive within the dream itself. My hands trembled violently, my skin clammy. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching, and stumbled to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. But for a fleeting instant, just as my eyes adjusted, the familiar outline of the distant peak seemed to waver, to shimmer, as if a layer of reality had momentarily peeled back, revealing something vast and unseen just beneath its surface. What was happening to my world? Then I saw it. It depicted a series of concentric circles, each one segmented, with smaller, jagged symbols filling the spaces between the rings. It was not a star chart. It was not a map. It felt like a schematic for something utterly alien, something that resonated with the impossible structure I had glimpsed in the signal. Dread tightened its grip, a cold hand squeezing my lungs. I knew then that I needed to find someone who might understand, someone who had seen beyond the accepted boundaries of knowledge. My search led me to the name of a former academic, a scholar whose career had ended abruptly amidst whispers of dangerous obsessions and forbidden texts. They had vanished from the public eye years ago, retreating to a remote corner of the world, a place where the old ways still held sway. I packed a small bag, my laptop, and a printout of the diagram. The journey was long, a blur of increasingly desolate landscapes. Smoke plumed from stone chimneys, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of my boots on frosted earth and the distant howl of the wind. The townspeople, bundled in thick woolens, eyed me with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. They pointed me towards the edge of the settlement, to a small, isolated cabin nestled against a backdrop of towering, snow-dusted pines. The path was barely visible, a faint indentation in the drifts. As I approached the cabin, I noticed the heavy, hand-carved symbols adorning the doorframe, stark against the weathered wood. They looked ancient, protective, or perhaps preventative. I knocked. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and acrid, like old batteries or stagnant water. After a moment, a shuffling sound came from within, followed by the clinking of chains. The door creaked open, revealing a gaunt figure. A tangled mass of gray hair framed their face, and a threadbare shawl was clutched tightly around their shoulders. How could they know? I stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin, though stale and heavy, a momentary relief from the frigid air. The academic gestured to a stool, then settled back into a worn armchair, their gaze fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. And I've been listening to something impossible. I described the signal, the impossible structure, the feeling of profound age. I left out the specifics of my astrophysics work, focusing instead on the experience of the discovery. The academic took the diagram, their fingers, thin and bony, tracing the concentric circles. A shiver ran down my spine, resonating with an unsettling finality. They call it the correction. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat. What are you talking about? The academic looked up, their gaze piercing as if seeing not just me, something vast and terrible behind me. You've pricked the membrane, Marcus. You've heard the song of the weavers, these symbols. They are not a map, not a blueprint for a machine. They are the unmaking. The fundamental laws you cling to, the constants you believe immutable. They are merely threads in a tapestry, and some entities. They believe the pattern is flawed. They seek to unravel it, thread by thread, until all is rewoven into a form more to their liking. My skin crawled. The air in the small cabin grew heavy, suffocating. Unravel, rewoven, it is where the truly ancient ones reside, the architects, the librarians of oblivion. They do not wish us ill, Marcus. They simply wish for order, an order that precedes and supersedes our own. and they are waking. The signal you heard. It is not a greeting. It is a precursor, a tremor before the earthquake. This is the point of entry, the first cut. It indicates a fundamental shift, a subtle alteration in the fabric itself, like changing a single digit in a cosmic equation, but that single digit determines whether a universe exists or merely collapses into itself. My mind reeled. This was not the raving of a broken mind. It was a terrifyingly coherent warning, delivered with an authority that shook me to my core. I could feel the blood draining from my face. This wasn't just about a signal anymore, it was about everything. But why now? I managed to stammer, my voice thin and reedy, the academic's eyes narrowed, staring past me into some unseen horror. Because the patterns are aligning, because the old cycles are turning, and because I have finally learned to listen. You've drawn their attention, and once they notice you, once they register your existence, they tend to incorporate you, not into their plans, no, into their fundamental nature. A profound, sickening realization bloomed in my chest. The signal wasn't just ancient, it was active. It was seeking, reaching, and I had responded. What happens when the weavers begin to unravel the threads of everything I knew? What happens when the weaver's loom unravels? The question hung in the stale air of my lab, a lead weight around my tongue. My colleague, a man whose easy humor usually diffused any tension, simply stared at me. His face bleached of color under the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't have an answer. I didn't expect him to. The truth, I was beginning to understand, was a thing no human mind was equipped to hold. I sent him home. He protested, murmured about shared responsibility, but his eyes betrayed a profound discomfort. He was a scientist, not a philosopher of cosmic dread. I watched his car disappear into the swirling snow that had, for weeks, kept the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved within its frosty embrace. The isolation was now absolute, a perfect echo of the chasm that had opened inside me. Alone again, the silence in the lab was no longer comforting. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. The equipment hummed, a low, constant thrum against the backdrop of the blizzard outside. My eyes drifted back to the screens, to the endless scroll of data. The structured pulses that had once promised a Nobel Prize, now promising only oblivion. I had responded. I had opened a door, and whatever was on the other side was now looking directly back. My hands, steady despite the tremor in my chest, moved over the console. I had to go deeper, not just to understand the signal, but to understand it. I pulled up the most recent transmissions, the ones that had come after my own, naive attempt at communication. They were denser, more intricate, less like a natural phenomenon, and more like an intentional address. I started with the anomalies, the sequences that defied conventional interpretation. They weren't random, not by any measure. They possessed a staggering internal consistency, a kind of self-referential grammar that defied every known linguistic model. It wasn't a code I could break with algorithms. It was something I had to feel my way into, like translating an unknown emotion. Hours blurred into a single agonizing stretch. My eyes burned, my head throbbed, but I couldn't pull away. I began to perceive repetition, not of individual symbols, but of complex ideograms, patterns within patterns, recurring motifs that seemed to carry an inherent weight. Each time one of these motifs reappeared, a low resonance vibrated through the floor, through my very bones, a sensation more felt than heard. It was like standing too close to an impossibly large bell, not ringing, but simply being. Then, a breakthrough or perhaps a breakdown. I isolated a particularly dense sequence, a recurring phrase that seemed to anchor the entire transmission. I ran it through every permutation, every statistical analysis I possessed. Nothing. It wasn't data. It was something else. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. The sequence, when rendered visually, had a strange, organic fluidity, like the slow, deliberate unfolding of some alien bloom. And as I stared, something shifted within my perception. The individual pulses began to coalesce, to weave together, not into numbers or symbols, but into an abstract, resonant shape in my mind. It was a soundless song, a melody constructed from pure, unadulterated information. It wasn't meant for ears. It was meant for the very core of consciousness, and it was speaking directly to me. My throat tightened, a dry constriction that made swallowing a painful effort. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The signal wasn't just transmitting, it was imparting. It was reaching across the unimaginable gulf of space and time, bypassing my senses, lodging itself directly into my thoughts. Fragments began to surface, not as words, but as concepts, vast and terrifying in their scope. The universe, as I knew it, was a flawed equation. Existence itself, a temporary error. The laws of physics, merely suggestions easily rewritten. And the entity, the source of this profound, resonant song, was the ultimate corrective. It saw entropy not as a natural process, but as a disease, a corruption in reality that needed to be purged. My hands trembled, hovering over the controls. The sheer audacity of it, the colossal, indifferent will behind such a notion, was enough to shatter reason. This wasn't a benevolent overseer. It was a cosmic surgeon, preparing to amputate existence. And its song, so ancient, so structured, was not a message of greeting, but a prelude, a declaration of intent. I felt a profound, sickening certainty that I was not merely an observer anymore. I was a recipient. The song was not for humanity, not for the stars, but for the one who had dared to listen. It had found an audience. It had found me. What did it want me to do with its terrible music? Neither did I, not really. But I felt the answer, a cold, spreading dread that settled deep in my bones, vibrating with the echoes of the signal. The lab, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, had become a crucible. Every hum of equipment seemed to whisper the entity's presence. I saw patterns in the dust motes dancing in the projector beam, patterns that weren't just random Brownian motion, but intricate, shifting geometries that pulsed with an alien rhythm. My eyes ached from staring. My mind ached from trying to unsee. Sleep offered no respite. The dreams were worse than the waking hours, though the line between them blurred with each passing day. The world outside the lab became a distant, irrelevant hum. I needed quiet, a different kind of quiet. I packed a single bag, my movements jerky and inefficient. The decision to leave felt both urgent and utterly meaningless. Where could I go that the signal wouldn't follow? But the idea, a desperate, irrational impulse, took root. I would go to the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. It was a place my grandmother had spoken of, a remote pocket of the world where time moved differently, where the old ways clung like frost to ancient stones. Perhaps there, amidst the enduring rock and the stubborn snow, I could find a moment of stillness that the entity could not penetrate. The drive was a blur of white-knuckled grip, and a landscape that seemed to ripple at the edges of my vision. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the world, pressing down on the narrow, winding road. The air bit with an icy sting, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something ancient and earthy, like frozen soil disturbed after a long sleep. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts, its timbers creaking with the weight of the snow and age. The proprietor, a man with eyes like polished river stones and a beard frosted with ice, simply nodded when I explained I needed a quiet place to work. He didn't ask what kind of work. No one did. The town was a place of quiet observation, not interrogation. But the quiet was a lie. The entity had followed, or perhaps it had always been here, woven into the very fabric of the world. Only now I had the horrifying sensitivity to perceive it. The hallucinations began subtly. The flicker of the fire in the hearth would occasionally shift its color, not to the orange and red I knew, but to an impossible violet, a hue that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. The scent of pine would momentarily morph into something metallic, like ozone and rust, before snapping back. My paranoia became a living thing, a coiled serpent in my gut. I started seeing the townspeople differently. The way a woman at the general store paused, her gaze lingering on my face for a fraction too long. The murmur of voices from the tavern, which sometimes seemed to coalesce into a rhythmic chant, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the frozen ground. I found myself checking the lock on my cabin door multiple times, convinced someone was trying the handle. Were they watching me? Were they part of it? One afternoon, I was staring out the frosted window, watching the heavy flakes drift down. Each one was a perfect six-sided crystal. But then, as I focused, one flake seemed to warp, its geometry twisting into a five-sided anomaly, then a seven, then an impossible fluid shape that defied all known crystalline structures. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The flake was gone, replaced by a normal six-sided one. But the image was burned into my mind. The world wasn't just appearing different, it was becoming different, moment by terrifying moment. I started to touch things, to ground myself. the rough wood of the table, the cool ceramic of a mug, the coarse wool of a blanket. But even these tactile assurances began to betray me. A moment of intense focus, and the grain of the wood would seem to shift under my fingertips, the lines writhing like tiny, trapped worms. The ceramic would feel impossibly smooth, then impossibly rough, the texture flickering like a faulty light. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This was a deeper transgression. The entity wasn't just sending signals, it was rewriting the very rules of perception, the fundamental properties of matter within my sensory field. It wasn't just showing me illusions, it was making the illusions real for me, altering the substrate of my existence. I was no longer observing the unraveling. I was part of it. My own reality was becoming a canvas for its chaotic brushstrokes. My hands trembled constantly. My stomach churned with a perpetual nausea. I found it difficult to string together coherent thoughts, the connections fracturing, dissolving into a sea of fragmented impressions and terrifying insights. There was the entity merely showing me what was always there, an underlying truth of a universe built on shifting sand, or was it actively dismantling the world, starting with the fragile architecture of my own mind? His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder, a hollow space in the room that made the hairs prickle on my forearms. He swallowed, a dry, rasping sound. "Marcus," he finally managed, his voice thin, "you need to rest. This signal, it's getting to you." He gestured vaguely at the screens, at the impossible patterns that had become my waking nightmare. He didn't understand. He couldn't. He saw numbers and graphs. I saw the threads fraying. I saw the thing behind the numbers. I watched him leave, the heavy lab door sighing shut behind him, leaving me in the precise, sterile quiet I had once cherished. Now the quiet felt like a vast, empty maw. I tried to shake off his concern, to dismiss it as the understandable reaction of someone confronted with the truly unthinkable. But his pallor, the tremor in his hands, they lingered in my mind. He saw the edge, even if he didn't grasp the chasm. I turned back to my console, the glow of the monitors painting my face in sickly hues. The complex algorithms I had devised to filter the cosmic static, to isolate the structured pulses, now seemed like a child's toy against a typhoon. The signal, once a faint whisper from the void, had grown into a roar, not in volume, but in its insistent, pervasive nature. My instruments, usually models of precision, had begun to behave erratically. It started subtly. A slight tremor in the floor that I attributed to the old building settling into the deep snows of the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. Then, the delicate gyroscopes I used for microgravimetric readings started to drift, their values fluctuating in patterns that defied all known physics. I recalibrated. I rechecked every connection. The problem persisted. I glanced at the thermostat. It read a steady 22 degrees Celsius. Lies. The air was heavy, thick with an almost metallic tang, like ozone after a lightning strike, but there had been no storm. Only the relentless, silent snowfall outside, burying the ancient traditions of the town deeper beneath its white shroud. My vision blurred for a moment, the sharp edges of the monitors softening, then snapping back into focus with an uncomfortable pop behind my eyes. I rubbed my temples, convinced it was strain. Too many late nights, too much caffeine. But the sensation returned, a momentary distortion of perspective, as if the very air itself had rippled. I pulled up the atmospheric sensors I had installed outside, monitoring the unique microclimate of our isolated mountain town. The readings were nonsensical, barometric pressure spiking and plummeting in seconds, wind speeds registering 0 even as a blizzard raged, and then, most alarmingly, a sudden, impossible inversion of temperature. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of my desk. This wasn't just data anymore. This wasn't just a distant transmission. This was here. The signal, the entity, whatever incomprehensible thing it was, wasn't merely broadcasting across the gulfs of space. It was reaching, it was influencing, it was expanding. I remember staring at the raw data, my mind struggling to impose order on the chaos. The gravitational fluctuations weren't random. They correlated precisely with the most intense bursts of the signal. Over my lab, my breath hitched. The entity wasn't just transmitting, it was approaching. Or worse, its influence was already seeping into the fabric of our world, like an ink stain spreading through a delicate tapestry. I stumbled from my chair, my legs feeling strangely heavy, as if the very ground beneath me was resisting my movement. I walked to the reinforced window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the perpetual twilight of the mountain winter held the town in its grip. But then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shimmering like heat haze rose from the snow-covered peaks that ringed our valley, but the air was frigid. The shimmer intensified, coalescing into translucent, shifting columns of light that pulsed with an internal, alien luminescence. They weren't auroras, they were too low, too contained, too utterly wrong. They bent the light from the few street lamps in the town below, twisting the familiar glow into fractured, grotesque shapes. A faint, deep thrumming began not through the air, but through the very bones of the building, vibrating up through my feet. It was a soundless sound, a physical pressure against my eardrums, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The glass of the window pane hummed against my face. My focus snapped back to the glowing columns. They weren't just standing there, they were moving. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with a sickening, deliberate grace, they began to converge. Not towards the lab, not towards me, but towards a central point above the ancient, snow-laden roofs of the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. A point that seemed to hover directly over the town's oldest structure, the bell tower, whose bronze bell had not rung in a generation. A wave of dizziness washed over me, stronger this time. My vision tunneled. The thrumming intensified, rattling my teeth. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The sound was inside me. The lights outside pulsed faster, their alien hues reflecting off the pristine snow, turning the world into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. I felt a desperate, primal urge to flee, but my feet felt rooted to the vibrating floor. The entity wasn't just expanding its influence, it was manifesting, and it was doing so right here, in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world. What would happen when those shimmering columns finally met? The biting wind howled through the narrow valley, rattling the window panes of the small cabin I'd rented. A fresh blanket of snow, impossibly deep, had fallen overnight, sealing the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, tighter than ever. I watched the flakes swirl, each one a tiny, indifferent whisper against the glass. It had been days since I'd fled the lab, the image of my colleague's bleached face seared into my memory. He hadn't answered my question then, and I doubted he ever would. Now, the silence of this place was a heavy shroud, amplifying the hum that had taken root behind my eyes, a low, thrumming echo of the signal. The flimsy plastic felt alien, a pathetic conduit to a world that no longer seemed to grasp the true scale of its own fragility. I needed to warn them. I had to. The first call went to a former research partner, a woman whose sharp intellect I'd always respected. His voice, when he finally answered, was a distant, crackling comfort. "Marcus, where are you? We've been worried." "I'm away," I managed, my throat tight. "Listen, I've found something vast. It's not just a signal, it's a reweaving, a fundamental shift." I tried to explain, to articulate the impossible angles, the paradoxical frequencies, the sheer wrongness of the patterns I'd observed. I spoke of the entity not as an alien, but as a force, an indifferent, ancient force beginning to pull at the very threads of causality. A long silence stretched, punctuated only by the static of the connection and the mournful groan of the wind outside. "Marcus," he said, his voice softening, losing its initial warmth. "Are you feeling all right? You sound strained. We're not talking about a new star, we're talking about the idea of stars being rewritten." My voice was rising now, desperate, a frantic bird trapped against a window. "It's not a discovery, it's an undoing." "Marcus," he repeated, firmer this time, "I think you need to come back, take a break. We can talk about this when you've had some rest." The line went dead before I could protest, before I could scream the truth into her deaf ears. Did she truly not hear the panic in my voice, or had the words themselves become too much for her to process? I paced the small cabin, the rough-hewn floorboards creaking under my weight. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a primal scent that offered no solace. The hum behind my eyes intensified, a low, persistent throb. I tried another number, this time a senior administrative officer at the institute, a man known for his unflappable demeanor and his ability to navigate scientific bureaucracy. "Marcus," his voice was clipped, impatient. "Your leave was unauthorized, and your colleague mentioned some concerning theories." "Theories?" I scoffed. These are observations, data. The very fabric of space-time is being altered. The constants, the laws, they're becoming suggestions, and whatever is doing it, it's been waiting, patiently. I laid out the data points, the impossible correlations, the accelerating decay of certain physical parameters I'd meticulously documented. I spoke of the cosmic background radiation, no longer a faint echo, but a discordant symphony of impossible notes. Another pause. The signal was a significant find, but these interpretations are highly unorthodox. Frankly, they sound like a breakdown. I'm afraid, if I continue down this path, we may have to consider professional review. Professional review. The words hung in the air, tasting of ash and dismissal. He wasn't concerned about the universe unraveling. He was concerned about my professional conduct. What good was professional review when reality itself was being rewritten? My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the phone. I had to reach someone who would listen, someone with the power to act. I thought of the agencies, the offices dedicated to global threats, to the unseen dangers. I found a number for a national security contact, a general clearinghouse for urgent, unusual reports. The voice on the other end was automated, then transferred to a young, bored-sounding operator. I repeated my plea, my warning, stripping away the scientific jargon, trying to make it stark, urgent, a fundamental threat to existence. The laws of physics are changing. It's not an attack, it's a recomposition, and we are unaware, unprepared. Sir, the operator said, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. I'm not sure I understand. Are I reporting a natural disaster that gravity might not hold, that time might not flow? Sir, she interrupted, a practiced weariness in her tone. I'm going to have to disconnect if I can't provide a verifiable, actionable threat. There was a click, then the dial tone, a monotonous hum that seemed to mock the cosmic hum in my head. They thought I was a prank caller, a madman. My skin felt stretched, tight over my cheekbones. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, seeing things beyond the visible spectrum. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, the walls pressing in. Later, I wandered out onto the porch. The air bit at my exposed skin, sharp and invigorating. A few lights twinkled in the valley below, small beacons of human life, oblivious. A figure emerged from the general store across the street, a local, bundled in thick wool and fur. Their gaze, when it met mine, lingered for a moment too long. There was no pity there, no recognition of my desperation, only a deep, unsettling stillness. A knowledge, perhaps, of things best left unspoken, of the ancient rhythms of this place that predated any human law. I was alone, truly, utterly alone with the knowledge of what was coming, of what was already here. What happens when the only one who sees the unraveling is dismissed as broken? I started to shake. The receiver still pressed to my ear, the dial tone a mocking drone. My fingers trembled, fumbling the plastic until it clattered back into its cradle. The silence of my small apartment, usually a comfort, now felt like a void, amplifying the hum that had taken root behind my eyes. It wasn't the sound of a faulty circuit, it was the echo of something vast and indifferent. I paced, a caged animal, my breath catching in my throat. My theories, once abstract constructs, were now a gnawing certainty. The signal wasn't just data, it was a precursor. I needed to see to confirm. I needed to know if the world outside was as subtly twisted as my own perception. The news channels were a blur of familiar faces and increasingly unsettling reports. At first, it was just background noise, a distant thrum of human activity. Then, a segment caught my eye. A local reporter, her voice tight with suppressed panic, stood before a building. It was an old municipal library, a structure I recognized from countless drives, but it was wrong. The roofline sagged at an impossible angle, not collapsed, but bent, as if the very geometry of the bricks had shifted. The windows, instead of rectangular panes, were now trapezoids that defied the logic of construction. My stomach clenched. I switched channels, desperate for a different perspective, a rational explanation. A meteorologist, usually jovial, stammered through a weather report, pointing at satellite imagery where entire cloud formations seemed to flicker, dissolving and reforming in the span of seconds. He called it atmospheric instability. I knew better. The internet, usually a cacophony of opinions, was spiraling into a collective hysteria. Forums buzzed with eyewitness accounts of roads that suddenly curved inward on themselves, bridges that seemed to ripple like cloth in the wind, and trees that grew branches at angles no botanist could explain. There were grainy videos of streetlights that pulsed out of sync with their neighbors, casting shadows that stretched and contracted independently of any light source. I saw one clip of a bustling market square where, for a fleeting moment, an entire stall, with its vendor and customers, simply wasn't there, only to reappear a beat later, everyone seemingly oblivious. My hands were clammy, vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't localized, it was spreading. Then I saw it. A breaking news alert flashing red across the bottom of the screen. Unprecedented structural anomaly reported in mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. My eyes fixated on the words. The reporter, a younger woman with wide, terrified eyes, spoke from what looked like a satellite uplink, her voice crackling with static. She described the ancient bell tower of the town's chapel, a landmark centuries old, now appearing inverted from certain perspectives. Its stone walls, she explained, seemed to curve inward as they rose, creating a concave shape where there should have been a convex one, its apex impossibly narrow. Local authorities are advising residents to remain indoors, she stated, her voice trembling, as several inexplicable disappearances have been reported. Witnesses describe individuals simply, this was it. Not just a signal, not just a hum, but a physical rewriting of the world. The fundamental laws of existence were fraying, unraveling like old cloth. The entity wasn't just communicating, it was manifesting. It was correcting. I saw a map flash on the screen, highlighting the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. Its isolation, its preserved traditions, made it a perfect crucible for this impossible change. Its ancient structures, built with the immutable logic of our reality, were now being reshaped by something utterly alien. The reporter's feed suddenly glitched, her face stretching and compressing like a distorted reflection in water, her voice devolving into a guttural sound before the screen went to static. I stared at the blank television, then at my own trembling hands. The hum in my head intensified, vibrating through my teeth. The world was folding in on itself, and I was watching it happen, unable to stop it. What did it want to make us see? The chill in my bones had deepened, becoming less an external temperature and more an internal dissolution. My awareness, once a precise instrument for celestial mechanics, now felt like a raw nerve exposed to the very structure of the cosmos. Everything was too sharp, too loud, too real. The world around me, the sturdy wooden beams of the old cabin, the familiar scent of pine and hearth smoke, all seemed to vibrate with an unseen frequency. I saw the air shimmer where it shouldn't, heard a faint, persistent hum that wasn't the wind or the settling snow. I had come to this mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, seeking a quiet place to process the signal, to understand. Instead, I found myself adrift in a sea of impossible perception. The heavy snowfall outside, usually a comforting blanket, now felt like a shroud, muffling a secret that pressed against the windows. The silence of the peaks was not empty but pregnant with an alien presence. I watched a snowflake drift past the pane, its delicate six-sided geometry suddenly appearing. Wrong. A seventh branch, faint and ephemeral, seemed to sprout and retract before my eyes, an optical illusion that left a metallic taste on my tongue. How could a simple snowflake defy its own nature? My head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the subtle shifts I now perceived in the world. The old grandfather clock in the hall, usually a steady presence, ticked with an irregular cadence, sometimes rushing, sometimes drawing out the space between seconds until my breath hitched. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to force the world back into its accustomed order, but the pressure only intensified the thrumming behind my eyelids. Was this what sanity felt like, fraying at the edges? When I dared to look again, the shifts were more pronounced. The wooden floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, seemed to ripple, not physically but visually, like reflections on disturbed water. The lines of the floorboards, the grain of the wood, lost their straightness, subtly curving and then snapping back. I stumbled towards the window, needing the stark, unchanging landscape of the snow-covered mountains, but even there, distortion reigned. The distant peaks seemed to fold inward upon themselves, their familiar contours twisting into grotesque, impossible angles that defied perspective. My breath hitched. Was the entity merely manifesting, or was it already here, dissolving the very rules of space around me? Then it came. Not a shape, not a form, but an imprint on reality, a sudden, horrifying clarity in the chaos of my hyper-awareness. It was a perception that bypassed my eyes, burrowing directly into the deepest parts of my mind. I saw it not as an object in space, but as space itself, warped and folded into dimensions that simply should not exist. Imagine a cube, but its faces were not flat, but curved inward, meeting at an infinite point, or a sphere, but its surface was composed of endless, interlocking planes that shifted and rearranged with every blink. My knees buckled. I tasted bile, hot, and metallic, as my mind grappled with the impossible. This wasn't a creature, it was a fundamental error in the universe, an entity that was the very fabric of non-existence. It stretched beyond my comprehension, a vast, silent correction. It wasn't altering things, it was simply being, and its being unraveled the very foundations of my reality. I heard a soundless scream within my own skull, a high-pitched whine that threatened to burst my eardrums. My teeth chattered uncontrollably. How could something so immense exist without collapsing under its own impossible weight? A single, terrifying thought bloomed in the center of my awareness, searing itself into my consciousness. The entity wasn't malicious. It wasn't even sentient in a way I could understand. It was merely correcting. It perceived the laws of this universe, our universe, as an anomaly, a flaw in a grander design. Our Euclidean space, our linear time, our predictable physics. These were the mistakes it sought to rectify. The very air around me felt thinner, as if the concept of air was being challenged, redefined. My hands trembled, clutching at the wooden sill, the rough texture of the splintered wood a desperate anchor in the dissolving world. I saw the entity's purpose with a horrifying, crystalline clarity, to reshape reality into something fundamentally other, something that fit its own incomprehensible design. The mountain town cut off by winter. Traditions preserved was not just isolated by snow, it was being isolated from the very framework of existence. The traditions, the stories, the very memories of its inhabitants, would they simply cease to have ever been? What would remain when the correction was complete? The world I had thought was too real. I was wrong. The world was merely too present. Now, in this mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, its reality began to fray, not with a roar, but a whisper that scraped against the raw edges of my perception. The chill in my bones had solidified, a block of ice encasing my very awareness, making every breath a shallow, painful effort. My vision, once a precise instrument for celestial mechanics, now felt like a lens smeared with an invisible, viscous film, distorting the familiar contours of the snow-laden peaks. The air itself seemed to hum with an unbearable tension, a frequency just beyond hearing, yet vibrating through my teeth, rattling the fragile architecture of my skull. Snow, pristine and deep, muffled the world, yet I heard everything: the crystalline snap of ice in the distant pines, the slow drip of melting eaves, the faint, irregular beat of my own heart against my ribs. These sounds were no longer separate, but part of a single, suffocating resonance, a prelude. What was it preparing for? Smoke, usually a comforting plume, rose from a single chimney, not dissipating, but coiling upwards in an impossibly perfect helix, defying the slight breeze. I watched it, my breath catching in my throat. The smoke didn't scatter, it held its form, a miniature swirling column, until it vanished abruptly, as if clipped from existence by an unseen shear. A tremor started in my knees, working its way up my spine, a shiver far beyond the bite of the winter air. My fingers, numb despite the thick gloves, felt alien, clumsy extensions of a body that no longer felt entirely mine. The familiar sensation of gravity, a constant companion, now felt conditional, as if the ground beneath my feet was merely a suggestion, easily withdrawn. What held us here? The light began to change. The sun, a pale disk above the jagged peaks, seemed to shrink, its warmth receding not just from the surface of my skin, but from the very concept of warmth. The world was turning monochromatic, stripped of its vibrant, messy life. I stumbled forward, needing to move, needing to confirm what my senses screamed was impossible. I passed a small wooden shrine by the path, adorned with dried flowers and faded ribbons. I'd seen it countless times in my wanderings. Now, as I drew level, the flowers didn't simply look old, they looked unborn. Their petals, stiff and brittle, seemed to fold inwards, not decaying, but reverting, losing the very memory of bloom. The wood of the shrine, its grain once rough and comforting, now seemed to possess an impossibly smooth, polished surface, reflecting the strange violet light like obsidian. My throat was dry. A profound, aching thirst for air filled my lungs, even as I gulped in the frigid air. It felt thin, insubstantial, as if the very molecules were losing their cohesion. A figure emerged from one of the houses, an elder, bent with age, moving slowly, deliberately towards the well. I knew him, or I thought I did. His movements were fluid, almost too smooth, like water flowing over stone. He moved with a purpose that felt both ancient and utterly new, a choreography dictated by something beyond human will. He drew water, the bucket clanking against the stone lip of the well with a sound that seemed to stretch and warp, echoing for far too long in the thin air. He lifted the bucket, his face, weathered and familiar, now subtly altered. His eyes, usually a kind, watery blue, seemed deeper, flatter, reflecting the strange violet light with an unsettling stillness. He drank, his throat working, and then slowly he tilted the bucket, pouring the remaining water back into the well. But the water didn't splash. It didn't ripple. The surface of the well remained perfectly still, a sheet of polished glass. My heart seized. This wasn't decay or destruction. This was a reordering. A silent, fundamental rewrite of the rules. The very nature of water, of sound, of reflection, was being unmade and remade into something else, something alien. The elder turned, his gaze passing over me without recognition, without even the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. He was seeing me, I knew, but he was seeing something else, something new. He walked back towards his home, his steps leaving no impression on the virgin snow. The flakes, light and airy, seemed to resist his weight, reforming instantly behind his retreating feet, leaving the path undisturbed, pristine. The mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was no longer merely isolated. It was becoming something else entirely, a tableau of quiet, incomprehensible transformation. A profound, suffocating pressure descended upon me, not from the sky, but from within the very fabric of existence. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of what I witnessed. The outlines of the houses wavered, their angles subtly shifting, becoming less defined, more fluid. The timber seemed to soften, its edges blurring into the violet-tinged air, losing the memory of tree, of saw, of human hand. The slate roofs rippled, like dark water, then settled into a configuration that was geometrically perfect, yet utterly wrong, defying the very concept of shelter or construction. The correction was not a cataclysm. It was a silent, insidious erasure, a gentle unweaving and reknitting of reality into a tapestry of pure indifference. The world was not ending, it was simply changing, and we, humanity, were not being destroyed, we were being rewritten, our essence reshaped into something that fit this new, alien order. My thoughts, once a flood of frantic questions, now felt slow, thick, like molasses. The elder disappeared into his house, and the door, made of solid wood, folded in on itself, collapsing without a sound, becoming a smooth, unblemished section of the wall. The very concept of entry or exit, of interior or exterior, was dissolving. The structure was now a monolithic form, a perfectly seamless entity. I looked at my hands, my trembling fingers. They still looked like my hands, but the skin felt taut, stretched like parchment. The cosmic entity had not sought to destroy us, but to perfect us, to integrate us into its own incomprehensible design. The laws of existence were not being broken, they were being adjusted, and the adjustment was complete. What was left of Marcus, the astrophysicist, in this newly ordered world? The chill in my bones had solidified, not into ice, but into a strange, resonant hum that vibrated deep within my marrow. My teeth chattered, a rhythm independent of my will, mirroring the faint, impossible pulse now emanating from the very ground beneath my feet in this mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved. The air itself felt thick, not with snow, but with a presence that pressed against my eardrums, a silent roar that threatened to rupture my perception. I stood by a window overlooking the town square, the heavy, frost-rimmed glass distorting the already shifting scene. The snow, usually a pristine blanket, now seemed to ripple, like a sheet of fine silk caught in an impassable current. The familiar steeple of the old church, a landmark for generations, wavered at its apex, its cross momentarily elongating, then snapping back, only to twist again into an unfamiliar, jagged spire. My breath hitched. This wasn't an optical illusion. This was fundamental. The few figures I saw moving through the square, a child bundled in a thick coat, an elderly woman carrying a basket, moved with an unsettling fluidity. Their steps didn't crunch the snow, they seemed to displace it, leaving trails that shimmered with an unnatural iridescence before fading too quickly. When the child turned its head, its eyes, for a fleeting instant, seemed to hold too many pupils, too much depth, like tiny, swirling nebulae. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, the sudden warmth from my skin a shock against the creeping numbness. Was I seeing this, or was I finally unraveling? The whispers, which had scraped at the edges of my perception, now coalesced into a low thrum that felt less like sound and more like a pressure in my skull. It wasn't a language I could comprehend, yet it conveyed meaning, recalibration, alignment, truth. The words weren't spoken. They were imprinted directly onto my consciousness, bypassing my ears, bypassing my understanding, settling instead into the raw, exposed nerve endings of my mind. My determination, once a fierce flame, flickered, threatened by this invasive alien logic. I stumbled back from the window, my legs suddenly weak. The room, a simple dwelling with rough-hewn wooden beams, felt less like a shelter and more like a stage. The solid timber of the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the same impassable rhythm I felt in my bones. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms. The pain was real. The world, however, was becoming anything but. I remembered the signal, its ancient structured beauty. I had sought knowledge, truth, but this wasn't knowledge, it was an overwrite. The entity wasn't communicating, it was correcting. And the mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was becoming the canvas for its grand, indifferent artistry. The preserved traditions, the very fabric of this place, were being rewoven with threads alien to human comprehension. A heavy wooden chair in the corner groaned, its legs bending inward, then outward, like a jointed insect, before settling back into its original form, albeit subtly different. The grain of the wood now held patterns that were too intricate, too symmetrical, patterns that defied the natural growth of a tree. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just distortion, it was a fundamental shift in the very essence of things. I could feel it now, not just hear or see it. A pervasive hum that vibrated through my very cells, a sensation of being both expanded and compressed simultaneously. My own body felt like a temporary structure, a hastily erected tent in a cosmic storm. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer volume of information assaulting my senses, the air shimmering with unseen equations, the walls humming with silent harmonies, the very dust motes dancing in patterns that suggested impossible geometries. The entity's influence wasn't merely altering the world around me, it was altering me. My memories, once distinct and personal, now seemed to bleed into a larger, impersonal archive, a vast repository of data that was being sorted, categorized, and ultimately reindexed. My identity, Marcus, the astrophysicist, was a label being peeled away, revealing something else beneath. I staggered to the door, my hand reaching for the latch. Escape, a futile thought, a vestige of a mind that still believed in boundaries. The wooden door, once a barrier, now felt porous, its surface rippling like disturbed water. I could see through it, not to the hallway beyond, but to an infinite, shifting vista of impassable colors and forms, a landscape that folded in on itself, defying all principles of perspective. It was simply unwritten, and now it was writing. My fingers passed through the door, not breaking it, but simply phasing through its newly pliable substance. There was no resistance, no friction, just a cool, indifferent acceptance. My lungs burned, not from lack of oxygen, but from the sheer wrongness of breathing nothing. I pulled my hand back, my mind screaming, a soundless shriek against the encroaching tide. The correction was complete, or nearly so. Humanity, our laws, our understanding, our very existence, they were all just temporary variables in an equation too vast to comprehend. We were an error state, and the entity was merely resetting the parameters. I looked at my hand, held it before my eyes. My veins, visible beneath the surface, no longer carried blood, but a slow, viscous current of what looked like liquid starlight. My fingers, once so capable of manipulating instruments, now seemed to stretch, elongating into delicate, translucent filaments that reached towards the shimmering air. I felt my consciousness expand, stretching beyond the confines of my skull, merging with the pervasive hum, becoming part of the vast, indifferent calculus. Marcus was no more, and the world, the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was no longer a place of human habitation. The snow no longer fell. It coalesced from the air in perfect, non-Euclidean fractals, each flake a miniature, self-replicating universe. The sky above was not blue or gray, but a swirling vortex of colors that defied the spectrum, a gateway to an unimaginable expanse. What remained of me, or rather, what I had become, observed it all. The entity had not destroyed, it had redefined. And in this new, absolute reality, where every particle hummed with the entity's truth, what was left of the old world?